And we're live. All right, thanks for tuning in, everybody. So we're gonna go over lots of cool things today. We're gonna make a brand new C# project. For those of you that haven't seen the first video, I highly recommend going on watching it because this is gonna be somewhat of a continuation of that video. Um, on the OneLeaf GitHub, I created a repository called C# Fundamentals, C# Basics. That's what it is. And I have the code in a folder called C# Tutorial 1 for all the code from the first tutorial. It's in a link to this page is in the description of the previous video. So feel free to go download that code and play with it, and make sure you understand how it works. Today we're going to go through making or basically diving deeper into some of the more advanced concepts of C#. I made a this time, since it's going to be a little bit more complicated, I went ahead and wrote up the code beforehand, made sure I tested it and that it worked, so that way we wouldn't run into any issues that would slow us down, so we could be a little bit more time friendly. So the things that we're going to go through today are the call stack and debugging. We're going to look at how garbage collection works and what scope is. We're going to look at some exception handling. We're going to look at C#'s properties, and then we're going to turn this into a small little project that allows us to basically make a payroll calculator. So I'm gonna keep this on my other monitor, and then we'll basically start this from scratch and code it up. That way, you guys aren't starting out with a big code base. So go ahead and open Visual Studio, whatever version you're on. We're going to create a new project. It's going to be a console app, and we're just going to call it C# Tutorial 2. And I'm going to save that to our GitHub repository. And I'll just go through you guys, at the end of this, we'll go through pushing up to GitHub so that way you guys can get used to it. And I think I'll keep that throughout the rest of my tutorial series. So in the C# Basics Git repository, we have the C# Tutorial 1 folder. Oh, I clicked on it. It's going to be bad at me. And then we're just going to create a new folder inside of here. And if we hit create, and we go open up the folder structure, you'll see now we have the tutorial 1 and now we have the tutorial 2 project. Okay, so I'm going to copy over my comments for the things that we're going over today, and we're going to clean this up a little bit. Alrighty, so the first thing that I want to teach you guys about is the call stack and debugging. Let's add in just some basic functions so that way you can see what a call stack even is. So we will just go into, we'll just create a recursive function, recursive meaning it's going to basically keep calling itself, right? So we'll say, we'll just call it recursion test. And basically what it's going to do is we'll pass in a number and it'll keep subtracting 1 from it until it hits 0, and then printing out, and then it'll return the final number. So we'll say int final number is going to be equal to whatever this guy returns. And then in here, all we're going to do is we're going to take in a value, and that'll be our start number. And then all we're going to do is we're going to start out with the base case of recursion. I don't want to get too deep into recursion. It's kind of its own concept. But recursion is a really good way to show off how call stacks work. So we're going to say if actually, we'll leave it at start number, I guess. It's not terribly accurate because the number is going to be changed, but we can leave it. If our start number is greater than 0, we want to return, or we want to call our function again and pass in start number minus 1. Otherwise, if we're not greater than 0, then we are either 0 or less than 0, so we'll just return our start number. And then we'll pass in how many times we want to do it, and we'll just say 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a breakpoint inside of this function, and this is breakpoints are how you get into debugging. We'll talk about them in just a second. So when we run our program, we'll hit this breakpoint, and we talked about this a little bit in the last video, but we're going to go. I messed up. So Stack Overflow exception. If you guys have ever seen the website Stack Overflow, which is a common place to ask computer science questions, Stack Overflow is one of the first exceptions that I ever ran into when doing recursion. And Stack Overflow basically means you've called the same function too many times, and it's thinking that you're gonna keep calling it infinitely. And we'll kind of show you how that works here in just a second. Um, okay, so we start, right, and we're passing in 2 to our recursion test, right? So if we hover over start number. So the red dots here, when I click on them, it basically says when the program hits this line, we're going to stop, and I'm going to let you examine the current state of your program. So um, notice how I can't hover over final number and see anything because it's not set to anything yet. I can hover over start number because it's passed into the function. And then you could either hit continue, which will keep going until you hit this breakpoint again, or one of your further breakpoints. You can hit the stop debugging, which will just depending on your IDE, will just keep running the program or it'll cancel the program as a whole. And then you have 3 main options that you'll use when you're debugging. You can do the step into, which will step you into a function, right? So if we put the breakpoint here instead and we stop and restart, and we step into the function, you'll see it steps inside of the function. It's highlighting over this line, right? Basically saying we're about to start executing the function, right? So when we hit step into, the function that it stepped into was this one, right? And if we had like some function and then another one after it, like dot something like something else, we would step into whatever the last function is first because it's going to execute that one first. So the next option we have is to step over. And I'm not gonna hover over these anymore to show you which ones I'm clicking on. I'm gonna use the hotkeys. So step into is F11, step over is F10, and step out is Shift F11. So if we use the step over F10, you'll see that I will go line by line through my program, right? Which is super cool. And then boom, we're gonna we're gonna get an error. So basically what this is saying is that we're inside of the function itself. We're going to keep calling it, right? And it's thinking that we're going to keep doing this infinitely. Like there's going to be some hard-coded number into there that says if you called this function 100 times in a row or 1,000 times in a row or some preset number, then you're doing it wrong, right? So it's gonna give you an exception, so you don't just keep doing it forever and eating up all your computer's memory. Okay. So what we'd want to do instead, I feel like I'm blind. What am I missing here? Uninstall dash. Sorry, I was looking at the stream chat. Zach, I'm blind. What am I missing?
1 sec, I'm looking.
Is it because I subtract one after I pass it?
Oh, it's a static route? No, then you should be able to call it.
Oops, I didn't step into. My bad. Yeah, okay, so it was because I was passing it. Okay, so what happened, right? The previous way I had this. So these are decrement functionality. So this would be the same thing as saying um, start number is equal to start number minus 1, right? So it's basically subtracting 1 from it, right? And then instead of doing this guy, I just pass in whatever start number was, right? So I'm subtracting 1 from it and then passing it in. What I was doing beforehand, right? You can put the minus minus before after it, or you can put the minus minus before it. And so basically what this means is it will subtract 1 and then pass it in, whereas if I do it the other way, it'll pass it in and then subtract 1. So what was happening is that I was passing it in, right? So we got passed in 2 the first time, right? And then we said, hey, Mr. Recursion Test, go past it 2 and then subtract 1 from the start number. And then it's going to keep it, infinitely calling it because it never subtracts before it calls it. Okay, so now, if we run it, I'm not messing up massively. Okay, so we can see when we first get into the function, our start number is 2. So is our start number greater than 0? Yes. So we should go inside of the if statement. And we're going to call our function again. So you can see if I go down here in Visual Studio to the call stack, you can see we started out, if you double click on these, it'll take you to where you're called, right? So if I double click on this guy, our current function where we're at was called from here. And then if I click on this guy, you can see this is where we're currently at. If I F11 into this function, right, you can see it just adds the same function onto it, onto the top of the stack. So you can think of a stack. We're using Paint. I like Paint. So we start out. Actually, I'm going to use just text to make it more simple. So we start out with main at the bottom of our stack, right? And then we call recursion test, and then recursion test calls recursion test, and then recursion test calls recursion test, and so on, right? So you're stacking these functions on top of each other, and when they return, what do? They pass whatever they return into whoever called it, right? And then this guy passes it into him, and then this guy passes it back into main, and the main method finishes, right? So you can see when we first pass in recursion test, it's going to be 2. We're going to subtract 1 from it, so this will be 1. And then it's 0 here, right? So if it's basically saying if it's greater than 0, we're going to call it again. But when we hit 0, all we're going to do is return 0, right? So this guy is going to return 0 to its parent, right? And then um, since we called this guy, right, we basically went into another function of it, and then when we return, we execute the next line after this, which since there's nothing after it, we just execute the return again, right? So this recursion is going to return 0, and then this guy's going to return 0, right? So this is how a call stack works. As you call functions, they're put on top of each other in the call stack, and then when they return, they're popped off the top of the stack, right? I hope that makes sense. Max, did that make sense to you?
Yes, mate. I've never actually seen that stack like little console window, but yeah, it does make sense.
Cool. Most IDEs or integrated development environments have some form of call stack visualization. Um, you just have to, if you're using Visual Studio Code or I don't know anything else, you just have to look up, where it's at in the UI. So we went over call stacks and debugging, right? So if you ever have a problem in your code, for example, like let's say you get shoved into a program at work and something's broken, you'd want to put in breakpoints at where you think it would be broken, and then basically debug it to figure out what the values are and what they should be, right? So I think in the future a good practice might be to we start the stream with a broken program and then we debug it, pretending as though we don't know anything about the program. If people would be interested in that, feel free to write it in the stream chat, and we could do it in the future. So that way, it'd be serve as a better example. Max asks, can you set up a function so that it automatically sets up breakpoints and steps through them, or have an external function that manages debugging in some way? Yes, actually, I actually learned this week at work. It's like system.debug debugging. Oh, is it diagnostics.debug? Pardon me while I remember how this works. Yeah, .debug. Start debugger or something like that. The debugger. Launch. Haha. So if I take off all my breakpoints and I hit start, this will launch the debugger at this point in time. Okay, never mind. We have to put in a breakpoint, right? And it'll launch the debugger for us, right? And then it'll stop right here. So this would be useful in like production level code, right? Because usually when you run applications, you can either just run them, right? But I'm running them in debug mode. So if I ran it as a release application and I had breakpoints in there without this guy, normally if I'm yeah, cool. So basically, it's saying your debugger release build. You could use like a just-in-time debugger, or normally like a normal production app, you wouldn't hit these breakpoints, right? Because you don't want your users hitting the breakpoints. But you could put these guys in the code base of a production app, and basically it would start the debugger for you at this point in time, and then hit any breakpoints afterwards. Good question. Sorry, I couldn't remember the the actual using syntax or the library that I need to use. Okay. So we're gonna cross call stack and debugging off the list. If you guys have any further questions on it, we can revisit it. I'll keep an eye on stream chat. Okay, so next what we're gonna talk about is garbage collection and scope. So um, C# manages garbage collection for you. So what garbage are we collecting? Numbers that we or variables and memory references that we don't need anymore, right? So let's say let's do this. Instead of recursion test, we'll call it garbage collection test. And what we're going to do is inside of here, we're going to say int test number is equal to 10. Just this is just going to be a an example here. We're not going any farther than this. So what's going to happen, right? We're going to call this function. It's going to be put on top of our stack. And then as we execute this function, any variables that we declare inside of here, you see if I type in test number, it doesn't pop up, right? Because we don't have access to the variables that are inside of a function, right? It's called scope, right? The scope of this variable is between this bracket and this bracket, right? We can only access this variable after it has been initialized and within and before this bracket, right? Because basically once we hit this bracket, the runtime or the virtual machine that's running C# is going to say, hey, this guy is no longer in our scope. We don't need it anymore, right? So we can remove it from the memory that we're holding, right? And then now we can release that back, and now we could reallocate that memory space to something else. I feel like that was a really brief overview. Let me pull back open the stream chat and make sure nobody else has any questions on that. That garbage collection and scope really is that easy. And when you hit this bracket, it may not instantly delete this guy. It'll queue it up for garbage collection and say, hey, you can delete this whenever we do some garbage collection. But garbage collection is kind of expensive to like look through all the references and figure out where to delete them. So it may like push that process off to a later point in time. So this spot in memory may be still used for, I don't know, another second or two, or maybe even a couple milliseconds. It just kind of depends on when the garbage collection mechanism decides to delete it. Are there, Max asks, are there no cases where local variables are kept on the stack? That is an important clarification. So, not that I can think of. So another, um, hmm, I'm trying to think of a good example to explain this question. Oh, I answered your question. Okay, never mind. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to talk about is exception handling, and I did go pretty quick over those, so feel free to pull me back and talk about those. So exception handling. What is an exception? An exception is something that happens in your program that isn't supposed to happen, right? It's an exception. It's not supposed to. It's not the way that it's supposed to happen, right? So what are some exceptions that could happen? Um, so there's it depends on which language you're talking about, but in C# in specific, um, there's like exceptions that you can get when, for example, I don't know, let's say, let's clean up our program again, and we're going to say we have string x, and then we try and say console.writeLine x. This would be an exception in the compiler, right? It says we're trying to use this variable x, but there's nothing stored inside of it, right? So this is something that you just have to fix before you could run your program. Whereas, a runtime exception is something that breaks at runtime. So an example that I could think of that is if you're trying to load a file, right? Let's say you're trying to like read data from a file. Well, if that file doesn't exist and you try and read from it, it would throw an exception, right? So if we say, and we'll get into using the file library. So if we say file dot, it's going to say the name file doesn't exist, so we have to import it from system.io. IO is a very common term used in most languages. IO stands for input output, right? So input and output from the operating system. It could be a file, or you could be reading like, from a Wi-Fi controller. Like you could be reading bytes off of the network, those type of things. Yeah, Max, that's another great example. Index out of range, right? Like let's say you have. We'll finish with the file example, and I'll show you that one. I think your example actually is a little bit simpler, right? So if we say we have an integer array and we're going to just call it, I don't know, numbers. And in that array, we have the numbers 1, 2, and 3. Oops. Haven't initialized array like this in a while. Okay, so basically what this means is like we just have an object that holds three numbers, 1, 2, and 3. And then let's say we want to say console dot writeLine. And if we want to write out the first number inside of in the numbers array, we want to actually print out the 0th, right? So if we open up Paint again and we look at my array, it's going to be this box that holds the numbers 1, 2, and 3. And if we want to grab the first element, it's actually element 0. The second element would be element 1, and the third element would be element 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so on, right? The numbers inside of it don't really matter. I probably should have made them something random, like, I don't know, 11, 42, and 53. The numbers inside don't matter. The indices in which you access them are what matters. So if we just print out the numbers at 0, it should just print out 1, right? Because that's our first number. Let's change this back to debug instead of release, and then add a console.read at the end so it doesn't stop. Okay, and you can see it prints out 1, right? Well, let's say, I don't know, for some reason you're like, oh, I'm pretty sure there's 10 elements inside of this. Let's grab the 11th element, or the element at index 10. Oop, did not mean to do that. Just hitting buttons. And it says system.index out of range exception, right? There's not 10 numbers in our array, and it says, hey, this isn't supposed to happen. We're going to throw an exception, right? So how do you handle these things, right? Because normally, if you were doing this in an application and didn't handle it, your application would crash, right? It wouldn't know what to do with the error that you had. So what you would do is you would wrap this guy in a try statement, and a try says, I'm going to try to do this thing, right? I'm gonna try and write this line. And what I want to do is I want to catch any exceptions. And actually, we'll keep this super simple right now. And we'll print out if an exception happens. We'll just print out exception occurred. And if we run it, you'll see we should print out. Oh my goodness, I'm bad. Now if we run it, I'm doing something horribly wrong. What am I doing wrong? So you can see, okay, when I ran the application, I put a breakpoint on this line, right? So it tried to do this, and then I hit F10, and you can see, oh, it caught the exception. Well, if we hover over the exception's null, because we're not using it. Oh, there it is. Now that we're inside of it, it fills in what's inside of E, right? So I created this variable called E. I could have called it, I don't know, exception, right, for example. But you can see what it fills in as the index was outside of the bounds of the array, right? So when you're catching something, you can tell it what type of exception you want to catch. You can catch multiple different types of them, right? If you know different errors are bound to happen. And then you want to do something once that exception happens. Maybe in this case, we just want to, print out that the exception occurred and keep moving on. But now we do something with that exception, right? We catch it and say, here's the thing that we want to do with it. And now our program can continue running, right? I'm not sure why it didn't print out, though. Maybe you can't console.writeLine in a catch. But okay, so to continue the point, if you want to catch like different types of exceptions, you could also say index out of range exception. You can catch a specific type of exception, right? And then I could do another catch statement and catch a different type of exception, so that way I can handle different exceptions in different ways, right? So I'm going to go back to working with files, because there's a lot of things that can go wrong when you're working with files. So let's say we want to read the text from a file, right? So if we use the file class from system.io, basically you can see it just provides methods for us to create, copy, delete, move, and so it basically allows us to work with files, right? So let's say we just want to read all the text from a file, right? And so what we pass in is a path. Ooh, I can type, I promise. There we go. Okay, so the path that we want to pass in, let's just say our file is in the folder of our actual project, right? Just in our project folder. So we can just right-click, create a new text file, and we'll call it read test. And then we'll just put some arbitrary data in it, right? And then we'll hit save. Okay, so now we need the location of that file, right? The path to that file on your computer. The easiest way that I like to do that is right-click on the file, hit Properties, copy the location. And then you can see it doesn't put the file name on at the end, so we need to add read test.txt. And it doesn't like these slashes because in C# in a string, right? I'm sure in other languages you guys have seen, for example, if I do console.writeLine and I do ASDF/T, the backwards, forwards? I can never remember which back. It's tilting backwards to the left. Okay, the backslash is an escaping character. And basically what that says is whatever character follows me, that character means something. So a /T would mean a tab, a /N would mean a new line. I know there's several others, but I can't think of any more off the top of my head. So it's trying to think, we're trying to do /U, right? You can see how the red line is hovered over it, and it says it's an unrecognized escape sequence. Well, what we could do is we could put another slash, and if I escape the slash, right, it'll say, hey, I actually do want this slash in my string. What we could do instead is we can add an @ sign to the front of the string, and it says, hey, the string that we have in here, ignore the slashes. I'm writing this thing exactly as it should be, right? So this string is equivalent to this string if I put in all the double slashes, right? So these two lines are equivalent. Okay, so when we read all the text, what are we going to get out? Well, we're going to get a string. You can see that's the return type, right? So we can say string file data. And if we put a breakpoint on our read line, let's see what's inside of our file data. So if we hit run and we hover over file data, you'll see we have just that arbitrary text that I put in my file, right? Well, what happens if we give it a bad address? Let's say, like, I don't know, maybe I did a typo and I accidentally forgot the T and I hit run. Oh crap, our program broke. We have a file not found exception, right? The file wasn't found, right? Like it couldn't find readtest.txt because it doesn't exist on my hard drive, right? Hi Flow Local. Thanks for joining. Okay, so what do we want to do, right? How do we want to make sure that if we happen to not have that file on our machine, that it won't break our program? Well, we're going to do what we did with the arrays. We're going to wrap them in a try catch. We're going to try to read all the text from my file and catch an exception. And I don't know, I'll just call the exception. It's just a variable that you can access. And let's make it on a new line so it's a little bit cleaner. And then let's console.writeLine, and we're going to print out what the exception is. And we'll say reading file data, comma, an error occurred. Because we want to be as descriptive as possible with our errors, right? So people know what's going on. And then we're going to concatenate the string. We're going to say exception dot message. And exceptions hold messages, right? So you could see on the array out of bounds exception, the message was like trying to access an index which doesn't exist in the array. In this case, it'll print out whatever that error message was that it was printing out previously. So if we hit run, what did I do wrong? It's not hitting my breakpoint. Okay, so you can see our file data is null because this line hasn't been executed yet. I can hit F10 to go to the next line. Our file data, we don't have access to it, right? Because we're outside of the bounds of that scope, right? We can't hover over file data and see what's in it. And now if we look at our exception, it's null because this line hasn't executed yet. It'll fill in that exception when we go to the next line. So if you hover over it, we can see we could not find that file. And then it should be writing the line. I am unsure as to why it's not writing the line out. Hold on, let me open up the other project. I had this stuff written down. Interesting. I was doing the exact same process. Curious. So what should happen is, whatever, however you want to handle the exception, you would do inside of here. Okay, so let's get a little more complicated. So you can see that my program didn't just crash. It should. Well, let's put another console.write line here and make sure it's hitting this line. We'll just put in some dummy output. Yeah, it's pointing. I feel like it's running my other application. Weird. Something's going over my head here. We will revisit this in just a second. So let's get a little bit more complicated with this, right? So we're not just going to be reading some mock data. Hold on, let me close this out and let's go open up the file. We're not just going to be reading some mock data, right? We want to we're going to start building up the application for making this payroll calculator, right? So we want to store, let's say, employee data, right? So how would we store the employee data? Well, we could say, the employee's name is Steve, and the employee's pay is, $10 an hour, right? And then, we could put, name Bob and pay is $15 an hour, and so on, right? Well, we want some standardized format that most applications would know how to work with, and that format is JSON. If you guys watched our data structures talk, it's in the Computer Science Fundamentals YouTube playlist. Feel free to go back and watch that if you are getting confused here. But basically what JSON is it's a data format that allows you to store objects. And I'm just going to pull up an example of JSON data here. We're just going to look at an image. And you can see that, for example, basically it's wrapped in these curly braces, and the curly braces represent an object. So this object has an image, a first name, a last name, a company, an email, a phone, and so on, right? So we're gonna do the same thing with employee data, right? And now we need a way to store that employee data. So we're gonna create a class called employee. So we're gonna add a new item, and we're just gonna call it employee. And we don't need the namespace. Okay, so what does our employee have? We'll keep with the example that we had before. We'll give him a name, and we will give him a salary. It's not going to be a string, it's going to be a float, right? Okay, now we're going to do something a little funky. We want these things to be able to be get and set from outside of this class, right? So we're going to make them public. But we're also going to do something a little funky, and we're going to touch on another point here. Properties. So what a property is basically allowing you to make a getter and a setter that acts upon this variable, right? So I could, inside the get, I could do its own function and say when we get a value, let's say for example salary, we'd check if he's an hourly or salary employee, and if he's an hourly employee, we'd multiply his hourly pay times the number of hours that he's worked this year, and the getter would allow us to make a calculation inside the property itself. We're going to leave it as get set right now, and then we'll come back to adding that in later on. But this is what we would need in order for the JSON library in order to work with our class. So we're going to hold on. We're going to just write an employee to the file, right? So we want to have an employee that we write to the file so that way we can read the employee, right? So what we're going to do is we're just going to create another function, and we're going to call it ReadEmployee. And what's this guy going to do? He's going to create a new employee that we write. So we'll call it employee, and we'll call him Bob. And we're going to create a new employee. And there's a few ways we could create this employee, right? We could create a constructor that takes in a name and a salary and whatnot and sets those variables. Or since these are properties, we now have this cool syntax that we can use that if we follow this guy with brackets, we can set the variables inside of these brackets. So we can say name is equal to Bob and salary, we'll say his salary is, I don't know, $10,000. So basically what this is going to do is this is going to create an employee, and it's going to fill in the field's name and salary with Bob and 10,000 respectively. And we can do this because we have properties, right? Is YAML not more common in .NET? Um, YAML, from my experience, is more used for configuration. So in my case, I want to store data. I don't want to store configuration, right? And JSON is more commonly used when we're talking about like client-server architecture. Um, if you're gonna have a front end, right? Let's say we're making the back end that like reads and writes employees from the file and sends them to our website, right? JavaScript is meant to work with JSON, right? It's JavaScript object notation. That's what JSON stands for. So more often than not, if you're sending data back and forth between a front end and a back end, you're gonna want to work with JSON because it's a self-describing format, meaning that you can understand, like it tells you what the objects are and what their contents are. So it's human readable, and it makes it easy to debug, right? Okay, so what we're gonna use is a JSON serializer. And this, bear with me for just a second. So we're going to create a string called employee data, and then we're going to set the employee data string that we're going to write out to a file equal to the JSON serializer, and we have to import this guy. So if we go to show potential fixes, and we're going to use system.text.json, and if we do dot, we now have access to a lot of these serialize methods, right? So you can deserialize and serialize. What does that mean? If I serialize an object, it basically takes the data of my object, the name of the object, its values, and converts it into some text format, right? You're serializing it, meaning you're putting into a format that can be sent somewhere. And if you're deserializing it, you're taking it from whatever that format is and populating an object with it, right? So what we want to do is we want to serialize the object, and what type of object do we want to serialize? An employee. And what object do we want to serialize? Bob, right? So what this should do is basically take this string, this empty string called employee data, and fill it in with the serialized version of Bob, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to, instead of read all text, we're going to write all the text. And you can see what this does is it creates a new file, writes the data to the file, and then closes the file, right? If the file is already written, if the file already exists, it's overwritten. So let's copy, let's put the T back, and let's copy the name of this file, and we'll say we'll write it out to there. So now, what am I doing wrong? No overload takes one method. Oh, okay. If you hover over file.writeAllText, it takes a path and then the contents, right? So this is the place that we want to write it to, and the contents would be employee data that we want to that we want to write to the file, right? And I really don't like having magic strings, right? Because if I make a typo, things could go wrong. So what we're going to do is in the class, we're going to say public const for constant, right? Because our path is never going to change. We're going to always read and write from the same file. And we'll call it employee data path. And it's going to be equal to that string. And I copied twice, my bad. There we go. Oh, we need to give it a type, sorry. So we're going to have a string that's always equal to this no matter what. It's just a const just means constant. So instead of having this string copied in here, we can just use the data path now. So now, whenever I change this guy, I only have to change it in one place, right? I don't have to make sure that it's set correctly everywhere. Okay, so let's delete all this extra, and all we're going to do is we're just going to call the function ReadEmployee, right? So when our main method starts, it's going to call the ReadEmployee function. We're going to create a new employee called Bob. We're going to set his values. We're going to create an empty string called employee data. We're going to fill that string with our employee turned into JSON, and then we're going to write that to a file. So if we just hit run, and if we go to our file now, and we open it up, I'm just going to open in Notepad because it looks nice. You can see, let me close out of the other stuff. You can see it printed out. The name of our person is Bob, and his salary is 10,000. It put a comma in between them to separate the properties, and it put brackets around them to simulate that this is an object, right? Okay, any questions on that so far? What does and doesn't make sense? Max, feel free to unmute and ask a question. I'm gonna take a drink quick.
Can you do it with like nested JSON objects and stuff?
Yeah, we'll get to that. Yeah, definitely. So let's say, for example, the employee has a class inside of it, like, I don't know, address, right? Hold on, let's go ahead and do that right now. Let's say the employee has an address, right? So let's make a new class and we'll call it address. And what components would an address have? It would have a string for its the street, right? So it'd be like 123 Meadow Lane, and then it would have we'll make it a string, but a zip code would normally be numbers, right? And then we have a street, a zip code, and a state. And then since we want this object to be serialized, we want to do the same thing we did with employee, and we want to give them getters and setters, right? So I'm going to copy this formatting because I'm lazy, and we will replace the names. And then if I just click anywhere on a line without highlighting anything and hit Control D, it'll duplicate the lines. And then we will copy the names of these things in. Okay, so now we want our employee to hold an address, right? Public address, address. And we'll give him a getter and a setter as well. Okay, so now in here, we want to say address. What did I do wrong? I did something wrong. Oh, I need to put a comma. Duh. There we go. Now it has access to address. So we'll say address is equal to a new address, and then we'll do the same thing that we did before. And we will instantiate it in here, just to keep things clean for now. So we'll say it's street is equal to 123 Meadow Lane. His zip code is equal to, I don't know, 11111. And his state, we'll make it a state code, so it'll be, I don't know, NE for Nebraska. Okay, so now we have a nested object, right? So if we run this, I can take out the read line because we don't need to keep the program open anymore. And if we rerun it, boop. If I reload the file, you can see inside of it has the address, right? And if I take this and I actually turned it into a JSON format, I would personally like to see it something like this. So it's easier to read. I guess these would be back one, right? So you can see the address. It has a street, a zip code, and a state, right? So these are nested objects, right? So we could get really complicated and lay out the entire data structure for what an employee would include, right? Okay, so now that we've written this out to JSON, I'm going to undo all those changes so that it is in the correct format that C# expects. Now we want to read from that object, right? So we're going to do another function called ReadEmployee. So we're going to call static void ReadEmployee. You're somewhat correct with the. So Max asked, so any C# object you can pass to the serializer, essentially. I believe, don't quote me because I'm not 100% correct. I haven't done this in a while. Any of the primitive types can be serialized, right? I believe it can even serialize. I don't know. Let's try it. I have no idea. Let's see if it can serialize an array of ints. And I don't know. This would be his raises, I guess. I don't know. Like, I know it can't. The serializer that I use in Unity can't handle lists or dictionaries because they didn't build in that functionality. But typically, it's just made up of objects, like of the primitive types. I'm not going to call a string a primitive type because it's technically not. But it would be integer, float, boolean, and enums, right? When should you use an enum, pal? Oh my goodness, we're going to give you a perfect example of that next. So let's add one more thing to this before we start getting a little more complicated. Let's add when we get our salary, we want we don't know if the salary is going to be an hourly or a salary employee, right? So let's actually change this to the yearly cost to the company, right? And now we want to add an enum, and we're going to call it employee enum employee types. And what are the employee types? We have a salary employee and we have an hourly employee. And then we're going to have a variable on the employee object that keeps track of what employee type that employee is. So now when we calculate the yearly cost, we can say, is this employee type salary or hourly? And if it's salary, we just, print out whatever the number is. And if it's hourly, we'll multiply it by 2,000 because there's 50 weeks that you work in a year times 40 hours is 2,000. I did something wrong here. Member names cannot be the same. Oh, I named this employee, so we want it to be his employee type, right? Okay, and we'll clean this up a little bit. So when we create our employee now, this is no longer called salary. We called it yearly cost, and we also want a secondary one. We want it called what do we call it? Employee type. Employee type, and its employee type will be employee types, and we'll say Bob is salary. Right, so we're saying he makes $100,000 a year. Whereas if we put 10 and hourly, we'd have to calculate how much it actually costed the company. We'll get to the actual calculating later, but we'd say, if he's hourly and it's $10 an hour, then we calculate how much it costs the company a year. But we'll stick to salary right now because it's a more simplistic method of looking at this. So if we print this now, if we just hit run, it's gonna write this out to a file, right? And we go look at that file. You can see the employee type is 0. Wait, that doesn't make sense. It should say salary. Well, if we go back to Visual Studio and we go hover over salary, oh, salary is equal to 0, hourly is equal to 1. Well, you can think of enums as somewhat like a map or a dictionary, right? It automatically maps a value to an integer, right? So that when I want to unconvert it, I know 0 is salary and 1 is hourly. I could manually set these. I could just say, I don't know, salary is equal to 10 and hourly is equal to 20, because maybe we have some codes in our database that say, salary is 101 and hourly is 201 or whatever, right? But we're just going to leave it default for now. If I change, oh boy, I hit a hotkey and I don't know what hotkey I hit. I changed workspaces. Oh, I hit weird. There we go. My bad. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's change him to a hourly employee, and let's just see if it changes the value to 1. I know it will. I just want to show you guys as an example. If I go refresh the file, you'll see the employee type is now 1, right? Penguin asks, so why wouldn't you just put the variables as enums? I'm not sure I understand your question. If you could rephrase it, I could answer. Flo asks, how long have I been programming? I'm 23 and I started when I was 19, 20-ish. I can't remember an exact date, to be honest with you. While Penguin is rewording his question, we'll move on to reading the employee. And so for reading, we're going to do the exact opposite, right? We're not going to serialize to the file. We're going to deserialize the object from the file, right? So what do we want to do, right? We want to say we want to get our employee data out of that file, and we're going to say we're going to file.read all text. And what text do we want to read? The path that we made, the employee data path, right? We want to read from this file. And so if I just put in a console, I just want to put in something right here to make a breakpoint on. Oop, oop, oop. If I put a breakpoint on this line, it'll stop after this line has executed, right? So if I hit run, I never called the ReadEmployee method, my bad. Now if I run, if I hover over employee, you can see the string actually holds the data of that file, right? Well, now we need to convert it from this, escape string. You can see, like, to get quotes, it does slash quote. We were talking about earlier because you'd have, it needs to be escaped, right? So now we need to take this long string and turn it into an actual object, right? So how do we do that? We say employee Bob is equal to JSON serializer dot deserialize. What type of object do we want to deserialize? We want to deserialize an employee. What string do we want to deserialize? The employee. And if I run it, and I look at the Bob character, and I open him up, I can see his employee type is hourly, his name is Bob, his yearly cost is 1,000, and his address was filled in, right? So we read from that file and turned it into a C# object that we can now access, right? So this allows us to have some format that we can write to and read from, and basically empty the contents of our object and refill them up as we, maybe our server shuts down and we need to reread all the files and load them into memory again. Okay, so that was a very good introduction, but it was small level thinking, right? We're making a payroll, hold on, let me rename our program. We're gonna make it called the Payroll Calculator. And yes, we'd like to rename all the references, and you can see now it renames my class for me. Let's go back and change the yearly cost getter, right? So what we want to do is we want to say the yearly cost when we get it, we want to check whether it's an employee type, or we want to check its employee type and say if it's a hourly, we want to multiply it by 2,000, right? We'll create a constant. We'll call public constant. It's going to be an integer, and it's going to be number of hours per year. And we're going to set that equal to 2,000, because that is assuming 50 weeks worked per year and 40 hours per week. So we're assuming that they get 2 weeks of vacation per year, and they work 40 hours every week, right? So if you multiply by 50 by 40, they're going to work 2,000 hours a year. So if you multiply their hourly wage, $10 an hour, times 2,000, they'd cost the company $20,000 a year, right? So now in our yearly cost, we want to fill in this getter. And now, instead of having it just be a semicolon, we can actually fill in this getter. Right? We can actually make it like a function of its own, basically, right? Come on, delete key. And so we want to say return, and we have to return a float, right? We have to return the yearly cost, and we'll say, we'll actually break this out as though it's a function. So we will put this on its own line, and we'll say if employee type is equal to employee types dot hourly, return my what's it called? Oh, I guess we have yearly cost. So we're going to return yearly cost times the number of hours worked per year. Otherwise, then he's a salary employee, right? So we're just going to return his number of hours per year, right? And now this guy is mad because if I make one of the getter, if I make the getter, I need to make the setter too. I think there's a way you can do it without, but I don't remember what it is, to be honest with you. I haven't done this in quite a while. So let's, yep, okay, so now we have the proper spacing, and then we can just say return yearly cost. Actually set, we're saying yearly cost is equal to whatever you pass in, which would be value. Okay, so this is a little oddity of C#, and so if I were to just say somewhere that yearly cost is equal to 1,000, we're going to say yearly cost is equal to whatever the value that they pass in. You can see if I hover over the value function, it's a parameter, right? And that's the parameter that's passed into the set function, right? So if I just went back to my payroll calculator and I just said Bob dot yearly cost is equal to 1,000, right? It's really, what it's really doing is calling this setter and passing that value in, that 1,000 value, and then setting our yearly cost to it, right? Okay. So now, if we run our calculator, we basically want to loop through all of our employees and add up the total cost that we're going to cost the company, right? So that way we can, do our yearly payroll or whatever of how much our employees are going to cost us, right? So at the end of this, what we want to do is we want to write out to the console, the company spends, some amount of money, spends X dollars, and we'll create an integer called total cost, and we'll set it to 0 to start. So the company spends total cost on employees per year. So if I go ahead and run this now, we should just see the company spends $0 on employees per year whenever it's done. I feel like I did something dumb. It's never hitting this last line. What am I messing up? Okay, let's hit breakpoints. See what happened. Great example to debug. When you're messing up your own code, not even looking at anybody else's. Come on, I believe in you. You can stop. We broke something. Okay. Man, my computer is chugging. I am doing something that's eating up my CPU. Interesting. Could not copy. Oh. This is mad because... Oh, okay, not why I thought it was mad. Hold on. Let's close out of my other Visual Studio and see if that's causing us problems. It might also be mad because we have this other console open. There we go. Okay. So we write the employees. Stack Overflow exception. Interesting. Oh. We put in this. I pulled a dumb. I did this guy. My bad. Yeah, that should work. Okay, so we write the employee. I hit F10. Okay, something weird has happened in my Visual Studio. I'm going to reopen it real quick. I must have done something dumb somewhere. We'll look and find it. Okay, so when we write the employee, we set its employee data, we write it to a file. We read it all, we deserialize it, set it to this employee, and then we do a write line, but we don't do anything with it. Let's just print out Bob for now, so that way it prints out something. Okay, so we write employees, Stack Overflow. Interesting. There's a Stack Overflow on our set. I am doing something just horribly wrong. Oh, okay. I did something absolutely wrong here. So usually what you're supposed to do when you have a property is a property is supposed to be like a public way for you to get access to a private variable, right? So normally you'd have a private variable, and we'll call it just underscore yearly cost. And usually the syntax is that you capitalize the public one and you either make it lowercase or put an underscore between the private one. And then when you set the public one, when you call the setter on the public one, it actually sets the private one, and when you get it, it actually returns the value of the private. Oh, also I use number of hours per year instead of yearly cost. It actually modifies and uses the private variable, right? So like if I have a yearly cost, I don't want anybody to just be able to edit this variable. I want them to go through this function, right? So if they're trying to get the employee cost, I want them to use oh, my bad. I want them to use this getter function to get it, because otherwise, if they try and grab the cost of an hourly employee, it won't work correctly, right? They'll get the wrong total cost, right? So I want them to use the public version of this and force them to use this way to get this private variable, right? Okay. So we read our employee now that we've written it. If we look at Bob, I can just hit next line and we can go look at what's in the console. You can see it just outputs employee, right? Whereas maybe we want it to like print out some custom way for it to write. So what we can do is we talked a little bit about how classes work in the previous video. And since all classes, like all classes inherit from object, it's inherent, right? I could just do object, right? You can see object is the if you hover over it, it'll give you a little description. It supports all .NET classes in the hierarchy, right? So basically, all things inherently inherit from object. And what that gives us access to is we can override. If I hit space, these are the three methods that I can override. I can set a function for checking whether or not one object is equal to another. I can do one to get a hash code, but we also have this toString, right? And so basically what we want to do is the base.toString, right? Base is meaning the what object tries to print out when we call toString, right? So when I do console.writeLine on the employee Bob, right? You saw all it did was output the class name. Really what this is doing is under the hood for you, it's calling .toString. If you don't put toString, it automatically calls it for you, because when you're doing a write line, you want to write a string to the console, and the language kind of knows that, so it handles this for you. So really what we want to do is we want to override this toString and return some way for it to actually give us like useful data. So we're going to say employee name is and then I can put in. There's multiple different ways of outputting strings, and I'm going to be lazy here. And I believe if we put a $, we can put in brackets the name of the variable itself. So I want to give it the employee name, which is just name, and then we put the closing quotes, right? So if we hit run, let me get rid of our breakpoints. We still broke something. Never hits this breakpoint. Interesting. So we'll pause and we'll go into see if it gets to ReadEmployee. Okay, so it finishes ReadEmployee. So if we go to ReadEmployee, hit F11 and step into, hit F11 on this guy, and we can see the employee. We get the string out, we get Bob out, and if we hit next line, it doesn't write the line. That is so peculiar. I am somewhat confused. Okay, we'll go into it one more time, and we'll see Bob. You can see now, if I hover over him, it tries to give you the inherent toString when you hover over it, same as when it's writing to the console. So you can see it uses our function. It says employee name Bob, right? Just like we said, employee name and then the name of the employee. The $sign here, when we're doing strings, allows us to, if we put something in brackets, it will use one of the variables, right? So we could have instead not used the $sign, and we could have done, plus Bob, or sorry, plus name, right? These two, these two are equivalent. There's another way to do it that I'm forgetting. Oh, you can do it, employee name. I believe that's in toString only, or name. If you do it in like the toString, you can give it like in brackets the number of the variable, and then it'll say if it's the 0th, it's the first thing after it, and if you put 1 and I put another parameter after it, like comma something else, it would use that one. I just wanted to be lazy so I could not have to do the pluses because that gets annoying. So we're just going to do it this way. But we also want to print out the rest of it. So we'd say the employee name, and the yearly cost, say yearly cost. And then we'll say we could print out his address too, but we'll just print out those two for now. So now if we rerun, we go into our ReadEmployees function and we hover over Bob. You can see it prints out his yearly cost, and then it puts it in a scientific notation. We could change the format here. I'm not too worried about it. What I am worried about is why this console.write line isn't working. It's almost as if when it tries to go to this next line, something is breaking it. I'm somewhat confused, not gonna lie. I have I'll figure out what this issue is. We're gonna open up the other project because that one's working, and then I'll copy over the information from there. So all I did different in this guy that we didn't do in the other one is I added two other functions called instead of write employee, it's write employees, because now we're doing payroll, right? We want to have a list of things that we're dealing with. And then I also wrapped them in try catches in case we couldn't write all the text. For example, maybe we didn't have access to that directory for whatever reason. Maybe the permissions on the computer don't give you access to there. You could get a permissions exception. And so I said, I gave it the function name so that way in the error we know what's going on. We said write employee failed with error, and then we printed out the message that it gave us. I'm almost wondering if when I renamed the class, that's what broke it. Now I'm a curious fellow. What if I copy that over? Sorry, I'm having fun with this. Feel free to stop me and ask questions here. Do. If I comment out this guy, comment out this guy, and comment out these two lines, do we hit this breakpoint? We do. And it outputs $0 per year. Okay, so something about the way read employees is done breaks our program. Okay, so if we just uncomment out write employees and the function itself, and we run it. Oop, I didn't uncomment the rest of the function. My bad. Okay, we still get down to here, and it still outputs the total cost. It does not. So weird. So weird. Okay, what if I do this? What if I break this out into its own function and say print cost? Interesting. This console .write line just does not want to work. I am doing something super funky here. I feel like I did a hotkey or something that messed me up. I don't know. Okay, so what if we copy this to a brand new project, and that doesn't work? I'm flabbergasted. I don't know. We'll just call it some dumb name of the application for now. And we're gonna have tons of errors because I didn't add the other classes. employee and address. Actually, we can just completely copy those over. Okay, it prints now. That is so weird. I messed something up in the other project. I don't know what it is, guys. I'm sorry. Well, we'll move on using this project. Okay, so I commented out this guy. Where were we? Okay, so we can write an employee to a file. We can read it from a file. And now that we read the employee, right? Let's return that employee and do something with it, right? So let's say we want to have a list of these employees that we print out. So a list of employee, and we'll say employees, and we'll just create a new empty list for now. And it's going to be mad at me because I didn't import list. Okay, we have access to list now. And so what we want to do is when we print our cost, right, we need to pass in the employees and loop through each one of them and print out the total cost, right? So we will copy this for the method signature. So what we want to do is we want to say for each one of my employees called employee in my list of employees. Oops, I deleted a parenthesis. Employees. I put the parenthesis in the wrong spot. For each one of them, I want to add to my total costs, right? So I want to say total cost, and we want to add whatever that employee's yearly cost is, right? And yearly cost is a float, whereas we made this an integer. So we need to make this guy a float. Or we could make the other one an integer, either way, it doesn't matter. Okay, so we want to write line, we want to say, we're going to do the dollar sign thing again to be lazy. And we're going to say the company spends X number of dollars on employees per year. And since we only have Bob, we should have whatever his total cost is, right? And so we wrote the employee Bob, his yearly cost is $10,000 hourly. So that should give us what, 200 million or 2 million per year? I don't know, let's see what he prints out. And it's still outputting with the formatting because it's a float. So let's just make it an integer so that way we won't run into these issues. We could format the string ourselves, but I'm just trying to keep it simple for now. We can run it again. I feel like we just ran into the same issue that we ran into last time. It's not running in, it's not hitting that, it's not executing that piece of code anymore. If we rerun it. Interesting. Okay, I feel like I did something wrong with the get set, so let's comment out all that code and just replace it with this guy. And now if we rerun. Nope, still mad at me. Oh, I am very dumb. We created this list of employees, but we didn't put anything in it, right? So let's say we want to add one employee to the list, so we'll say employees.add. And we want to add whatever that employee that we read from the file. And instead of just printing out the employee here, let's return that employee. So now we're going to return Bob. So what's going to happen is we're going to call this ReadEmployees function, or employee, and it's going to add that. It's going to add Bob to the list, right? So if we put a breakpoint here, and we look at employees, you're going to see there's one thing inside of our employees list, and if we open it up, that one thing is Bob with the yearly cost of 10,000. And if we open him up, we can see all of the data is actually filled in, right? And so when we go to print the cost, we have 0. We go through our employees, right? So the first employee is going to be Mr. Bob. So we're going to add his yearly cost, which is 10,000. And we're going to go through it. It went back up to the top of the for loop to see if there's any more, and then you could see it skipped over this line because there wasn't another employee in the list. And now we're going to write the line out. And for some reason, it doesn't write out. Okay, you know what we're going to do? Since the console's being a butt, we will just print this out, or we will just write this output to a file, right? So we can say file dot write all text, and this is actually, maybe we should have this in like right away. Let's have a log file that logs all of our stuff, right? So let's duplicate this path, and we're going to call it file log, or I don't know, we'll just call it log. So we're going to write all text, and what we're going to write, we need the path, which will be the, did I rename it? Nope. We'll call it the log path. So we're going to write the error log, and what's inside of it is going to be, we'll just make this a string. We'll say log output is equal to this. And we'll just write that log output. So now, if we run our program, it should finish. We should have a file in our workspace called log. And if we open that up, you can see the company spends $10,000 on employees. Okay, so we know our program works. I just did something dumb with the console. I don't know what it was. We're not too worried about the console. We're more worried about working with these files, right? But if we rerun through this, we create an employee, right? And then we write him, right? So let's break this down a little bit. I don't think write employee should also create the employee, right? That doesn't 100% make sense, right? So let's create a function that'll just create employees for me, right? Let's call it like generate employees or something, right? So let's call static void generate employee. And actually, we don't want it to be void. We want it to actually return an employee because it's going to create an employee and return it, right? And so what we're going to do is basically do this and then return it, right? But maybe we want to have like a list of names that it generates from, and it does that. For now, we'll just assume that this is how we want it, and it'll just keep generating an employee. So now what we can do is, instead of reading from our employee list when we write employees, when it writes an employee, the employee that it'll write is Okay, so there's a few ways we could do this. We could generate the employees and then write them, right? Or we could I think that's actually the best way to do it. Never mind. So yeah, let's create our employee list. So let's pretend, we have like a database of employees, right? So we're going to say employees.add and then generate employee. And then we can just do this a couple times, right? Let's say we want to generate 4 Bobs. And then, we could change the names or whatever, but we're just doing this as an example, right? So we generate the employees. So this list will have 4 employees, all named Bob, all with the same address inside of it. And then now we don't want to write one employee to our file. We want to write multiple, right? So let's close these out to make it simple. So we're going to make a new function, and we're going to call it write employees, plural, right? Let's keep our write employees function, and then or write employee, and all it's going to do is just you call the generate employee, which is going to be equivalent to basically just creating Bob and passing him in, right? So now we're going to write employees, and what we're going to do is we're going to say instead of serializing one employee, we want to serialize a list of employees, right? And what is that list going to be? The list that we generated, right? So we can just pass in employees to write employees plural, and then write employees can take in a list of employees called employees. So now, let's get rid of read because it's not doing anything yet, and we'll get rid of print cost. So all we should do now is we should create a list of employees and write them out to a file, right? So if we run it, let me go look at our file. You can see we have, a multiple of them, right? Like if I copy this and I go, I don't know, we'll just go here. We'll type in JSON formatter. So if I just paste in my JSON and hit process, it'll format it for us, right? So if I blow this up, you can see we have an employee named Bob, another employee named Bob, another employee named Bob, and yet another one named Bob, right? So we put all 4 of those, and then it generated it into JSON. And the difference between what it was before, right? It was originally just this guy. Well, now it put it in a bracket, right, representing that it's an array of objects, and put them in a list separated by commas, right? And that's how JSON formatting works. So now we want to read all of those employees back in, right? So now we can create a new function instead of read employee. We'll say read employees plural. We'll close this guy out because we're not going to use him anymore. And we're going to keep it the same data path. I don't like the file name read test. We'll rename it to employee database. And then now when it's deserializing, it's going to do the exact same thing that it's doing when it's serializing. Instead of just having one employee, it's going to deserialize a list of them. And now it's going to be mad, and it says, you're deserializing a list, but you're trying to set it to one of them. So what do we need to have? A list of them called employees. And then now, we're not going to return one employee, we're going to return the list of them that we created. And what's that list? The one that we deserialized, right? So now when we read the employees, right? Let's say employees, just to prove that this works, we're going to say employees is equal to a new list down here. So what's this going to do? We're going to create a list of employees. We're going to add 4 items to it. We're going to write them to the file. We're going to empty our list that we had. We're going to read the employees that are from that file, and we're going to set our list to that, right? So I'm clearing out that list here to prove that when we call read employees, it's going to fill in that list again, and then we can print the cost for all those employees, right? So I'm going to put in a breakpoint right here. And so what's going to happen is as we run, we hit this breakpoint, and if we go to our files, you can see we have our employee database that was created. If we open that guy up, we see Bob once, we see Bob twice, and we can assume that there's 2 more. You can see our employees list has 4 of them. After we execute this line, our employees list is empty, right? There's 0 in the count. After we execute the read employees line, we have 4 employees in there now. So you can see it was read from the file correctly, right? And then now when it prints the cost, it should add up 10,000 4 times, so it should print out 40,000 into the file. So if we just hit continue and let it run, and we open up our log, you can see we spent $40,000 per employee per year. Okay, we've been doing this for an hour and a half. I know you guys are probably losing some degree of focus. Let's ask some questions and let's get you guys back to being interactive. What questions do we got? Max, you got any questions there? I'm going to assume you are away from the computer, and nobody was asking any questions in chat. Oh, did I hear you?
No, I am here. No, it all makes sense, but maybe if you could do it like more dynamic, like making employees.
Make it more dynamic?
Yeah, rather than just like hard coding, like
Oh, so generate some random employees.
yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Okay, so let's what would be a good way to do that? Let's create a new class called the employee randomizer. employee randomizer. And this guy is just going to do what our generate. Oop, we can get rid of all this extra code. Actually, we wanted that. I take it back. This didn't break our console.writeLine. We still want it. It's doing the correct functionality. But we're not using. Why are you green? It's never used. Lies. We're using it right here. Okay, so our employee randomizer is going to do exactly what generate employee does. So we're going to take this guy and we're going to copy him. We're going to cut and paste inside the class, preferably. And so now when we call generate employee, let's instead of this, let's say employee randomizer dot get random employees. And we'll say it passes in an integer, and we'll say this like generates however many employees we want. Let's just say we want to start with 5. And then we will make a constant for that up at the top of the file. And so we'll say integer number of employees to generate. I know that was a very verbose name, I'm sorry. Okay, so now let's go implement this get random employees function. And notice how we didn't have to create an employee randomizer and then call get random employees on it, right? We're going to make it a static function so that we don't have to create an employee randomizer, because then we can use it anywhere without having to create an instance of it, right? So if we say public static, I don't remember what I called it, get random employees. And it's going to take in an integer for number to generate. So what's it going to do? 4, starting at 0, and then going up to the number that we told it to generate. And this is actually going to return a list of employee, right? So we need a list of employees to add to. New employees. And we'll just make it empty to start. Hi, Ivan. Awesome, yeah. Well, if you can come up with any more suggestions on things that we want to add to this, I'm kind of running out of ideas. Max gave me a really good idea to make this more randomized, so we'll go with that, and then if you can come up with more when we're done, we can keep going. So all we want to do is we want to say new employees dot add. So we want to add to our new employees list, and what we want to add? A randomly generated employee, right? And then when we're done with that, we just want to return that list that we created, right? So now what we have to do is we have to make this generation random, right? So to make it random, let's just cheat a little bit. We're going to create a list of employee names, a list of employee yearly costs, and a list of employee types, and it'll just randomly select from that list. Or, you know what? Let's just do this. We're going to create a random equals new random. We'll say random.next, and it takes in a minimum and a maximum. So we'll say the employee salary can be between, I don't know, 100 to 100,000. And then the name. How do we generate random strings? I know we can just pick from a list, but I'm kind of curious. C# name generator. How would somebody else do it? I'm curious. Huh. Cool. So we just have a list of constants and vowels and just say add a constant, then add a vowel, then add a constant, then add a vowel, it looks like. Interesting. Okay, we're gonna cheat. We're just gonna have a default list of them. So we'll just say public list of string random. We'll just call it names. It's equal to a new list, and then we'll just fill it in and call it Bob, Sally, Fred, Max. Okay, so then we just say let's do the same thing that we did for this guy, and we'll say we can do a random.next, which basically gets the next random number, right? And we'll say it can be between 0 and the length of our names list, right? Let me close Steam so I could get notifications. Okay, names dot, and it's count, right? So rather than doing length for an array, you have count for a list. So this is saying, let's get a random index for this guy. So let's say int name index is equal to, oh, it has to be static, sorry. You can't reference static things, you can't reference non-static things from a static function without creating an instance of it, and we're not going to do that. So now we can just say names at name index, right? So we got a random number, right? So if it was 0, it would be equivalent to Bob. If it was 1, it would be Sally. If it was 2, it was Fred, and 3, it was Max, right? So we're saying get something between 0 and 4, right? And then put something at that index. But if you look at next, it is, I believe the max value, it doesn't actually hit the max value. It's exclusive, right? So if it's 0 on one side and 4 on the other, it actually only goes between 0 and 3. We can test that. This might throw an error, but we'll find out. So we get a random name, we get a random cost, and then, I don't know, we could say random dot next between 0 and 1. Hold on, let me look up random. Yeah, so it's exclusive, right? So it doesn't. The bottom is inclusive, meaning it includes the minimum value, and the max is exclusive, meaning it'll include one less than that, right? So if our min is 0 and our max is 2, it'll be between 0 and 1. So we want between 0 and 2 for our enumerator, right? Because salary is 0 and hourly is 1, so we want either 0 or 1, right? Where was I at? The randomizer. So let's say boop 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 boop. Employee types random type is equal to employee types dot is equal to, I can just set it to the integer, right? Yeah, no. New employee types. I can't remember how to do this. C# enum. You can see how the guys that if you have error codes, you could set them to some specific value, right? I guess that's a better example than what I used. Conversions, there we go. Oh, you just cast it. So we do random.next between 0 and 2. And we cast that to an employee type. So if it's 0, this will cast it into salary. If it's 1, it'll cast it into hourly. So then we pass in that random type that we made. And I kind of like the format that we have where we don't have the randoms in the actual creation of the object. So we will do the same thing for int random yearly cost. And then we'll pass that guy in. I personally feel like that's cleaner. Okay, so for addresses, I don't know, we could just output random strings. Is this random enough for you, Max? Does this give you enough randomness? Because basically what we would do for the street, zip code, and state is the same thing that we would do for selecting from a list of names. And then so having the random yearly costs will let us debug how the yearly costs work. We'll add some spacing. Okay, let's give her a try. Boop. We had build errors. Oh yeah, so it needs to be that guy. Yeah, and you return an employee. Cool. What are you mad at? Inaccessible. Oh, I didn't make it public. Okay. So now what we should do is we should get a random list of 5 employees. We should write them to a file. We don't need to empty that list anymore. We're going to read them from the file and set them equal to our list. We're going to then print out the cost of them. So I'm going to put a breakpoint here so we can kind of add up what we think the value should be and make sure this is working correctly. So if we hit play, it's going to break right here. Let's go check our file. We don't need this guy anymore. So if you open this with Notepad++, you can see we have a yearly cost of a lot. Employee type is 1. We have Sally. We have Bob with a yearly cost of a lot. I feel like I messed up on the randomizer for that. That is way too expensive. Okay, so what happened, right, is we said, they were hourly, and we still let them be between 100 and 100,000. So then let's say salary employees can be between 10,000 and 100,000, and hourly employees can be between, I don't know, $10 and $100 an hour. So we'll say if the random type of employee is equal to hourly, then our yearly cost will be between $10 an hour and $100 an hour. Otherwise, we can be between 10,000 and 100,000. And then we will set it to 0 to start, and then fill it in here. Okay, so now we should get more reasonable values. Oh, forgot a semicolon. Okay, so now if we hit play, gonna hit our breakpoint, and we go here, and we say yes, we want to reload a file. We can see we have 1111. Oh, that's our zip code. Sorry. It scrolled over. Let's copy this and go back to our JSON formatter, so it's a little bit easier to read. Okay, so we have a yearly cost of 31690. That's a salary employee. Okay, so let's open up a calculator and make sure this adds up correctly, right? So we have 31690 plus 12088 plus oh, that looks like it didn't calculate correctly. 2,000 times. Oh, okay. So it's 120,000, which is 2,000 minus 60, right? Or 2,000 times 60, right? So this guy was paid $60 an hour. But you can see it printed out 120,000 because when we uh, accessed it, we multiplied it by the number of hours per year, right? So this getter automatically handles that for us, right? Okay, so then we add 120,000, and then we add 28544. Oh man, I deleted it. 28544 plus. Oh, and we made 5 employees this time, didn't we? Yes. 198,000. Okay, so this should be what it prints out to our log file, right? 390,000. So we have it stuck on the debug point right here. So if we loop through, we can see our total cost starts out at 0, and we have a yearly cost of 31,000. And I'm actually moved the breakpoint down to here so it skips over all that jazz. We have a 12,000, a 24,000, and if we go look at the file, I did something horribly wrong. Interesting. Let's try it again. I feel like there's 2 windows open and that broke it. We don't have any breakpoints. If we refresh, that seems like an unreasonably large number. So we have 59,000, 88,000, and we can just watch down here what the total cost is every time. 100, 440, 170, 190. Oop, I Okay, so if you hit continue, like it runs through all of the setting up of this and then comes back to this line. So we can hit it 1, 2, 3, 4 times, and then we can hit F10 to go off. And it gave us way bigger of a number than I expect. So we can go look at all of our employees. Oh, you see how it's adding all the extra zeros to the end of them? Did we do it wrong? If they're hourly, we do it this way. Otherwise, they're salary, so they're between this number and this number. 2,000 with 2 zeros after is... Oh, you can get 2 million. Wait. Is my math bad? Yeah, the highest salary we can have is 200,000. So the biggest number we should get is 1 million, right? Because we have 5 of them. So where'd we mess up? I feel like it's still multiplying bigger than it should be. All right, let's run through it one more time. I'll go slower, my bad. Okay, so we step over this line. Our employees' yearly cost is way too big. You can see his yearly cost is 172,000, but when it's the underscore yearly cost, the private variable is 172,000, but when we try and take it out, it's 2,000 times that. So it looks like, oh, hourly got way too big of a salary. So it's not that we're calculating it wrong, it's that for some reason this isn't working correctly. Alrighty, well, let's breakpoint inside of this guy. We will breakpoint right as we're about to return him. Okay, for the first guy, his random yearly cost is 76, 63, 69,000, and 69,000, 64,000, 84,000. And you can see it's like multiplied after the fact. Didn't we have this number last time? Am I not clearing the file out? Let's try this. Let's not read or write, and let's make sure that's not part of our problem. See, this is fun that I run into issues that are probably just super simple and I'm just not seeing it. But now we can debug and see how that would work. Okay, see, now that's a more reasonable number, right? So somewhere in our file reading and writing, it broke. I'm assuming when it is either reading or writing, it is multiplying it by 2,000, and it shouldn't be. But I'm too lazy to go look into that, unless you guys are curious what the issue is. Actually, we're going to upload this code to GitHub afterwards, so we should probably take the time to figure it out. Does anybody want to go down a different path rather than me debugging this, or is this interesting to you guys? Okay. So I went and looked at the file that we wrote to, right? You can see Sally's salary was 152,000, but when we pulled it out, it was like 300 million or whatever. So writing the employees isn't the problem, it's when we're reading them, right? So if we go ahead and let's debug through read employees. So I put a breakpoint when we're generating the random employees just to look at their salaries down here to make sure that they're not broken here. And if you look at it, you can see none of them are higher than they should be. And if you look at the employees here, rather than hovering over them, if you like happen to miss like opening one of these menus, it'll like close all of them, right? So I like to do it down here. So we can see Fred's yearly salary was pulled out and was massively multiplied, right? So also they kept the same name, so we could probably make a randomizer so it doesn't pick a name that was used before, or we could like combine them with first and last names, and it would lower the chances that they have similar names. But um, let's go look at Fred. He's hourly, and his yearly cost is 120,000. So I'm wondering if we go and we reload our employee database, and Fred, if we scroll to the end, actually, we're going to put this in the JSON formatter. So he has an employee type of 1, which is hourly, and his yearly cost is 120,000. So somehow it got set incorrectly in the file itself when it was writing. So let's pause right before we read the employees and make sure that I'm not crazy. Okay, so we're going to start to read the employees. So now we should have written them. We put them in the JSON formatter. 55, 95, 35, 166,000, and hourly. That's possible. 82,000 and hourly. Okay. So now, if we go into read employees, and we go look at their costs. Okay, so all of the hourly employees are being messed up, right? Oh, you know why it is? When we write the employees, right, when it tries to serialize them, it calls the getter, right, which multiplies it by 2,000. And then when we pull them out, it calls the getter again, and it multiplies them by 2,000 again, right? So how do we fix that? I'm curious. Hmm. I know I've ran into this issue in the past, and I can't remember what I did to solve it. I mean, we could cheat, and we could say, once we deserialize all of them, loop through them for each employee in our list of employees. If the employee, we're duplicating names, so we have to say like I don't know what you call E to cheat. If that employee's actually, this should be named employee. This should be called employee data, right? Because this is like our employee database. So basically say if the employee's type is hourly, we divide its yearly cost by 2,000. And then return them, right? So now we shouldn't run into any of those insane numbers. Now we can just get rid of all of our breakpoints. And if we go look at our files, if we reload this file, and we go look at it in the JSON formatter, we can see all the yearly costs are feasible. If we go look at the output log, 190K, right? We deemed our highest cost was $1 million if everybody was hourly and getting paid $100 an hour. So that's not an ideal way of fixing this. I can't think of a better one off the top of my head. If someone is seeing something that I'm just blatantly missing, feel free to yell at me. But it works, right? So, what do we want to work on next? What can we add to this? Let me close out of a bunch of stuff. Max, any ideas?
I don't know, something to do with their like holiday or bonus.
Add in bonuses?
Yeah, really fun.
I like that. Okay, so let's do this. Let's add in maybe a performance, right? So let's say like, if their performance is 0, they get like a 1% bonus. If their performance is 100%, they get like, I don't know, a 10% bonus or something. So let's add a float called performance. And then let's go to our randomizer and say our employees' performance is going to be equal to, we'll get a random performance. So we'll say float random performance is equal to random.next. And if we look at the parameter types we can have, they're all integers. So let's say it's between 0 and 100. And it's a float, right? So we're going to say we want, if it's between 0 and 100, we want to get a percentage. If it's 50, we want 0.5, so we want to divide it by 100. And we're going to run into a strange error here where this will always output 0 because it thinks this is an integer, right? So we need to convert this guy to a float so it will not round down. Let me set his random performance. And then now when we're calculating the employee's yearly cost, we'll say int total yearly cost is equal to 0. And then we'll say the total yearly cost is equal to this guy. And same for this guy. And then afterwards, you'll return total. Actually, since its name is total yearly cost, the total yearly cost will be its current total yearly cost times his performance, right? From 0 to 100%. And then let's like divide it by 10 so the max they can get is 10%, right? And this is a float, so we need to. No problem, Max. Basically, 10% of his performance is what we want to convert into a bonus. And let's actually not divide it by 100. We'll keep it as an integer. And we will say performance as an integer between 0 and 100% satisfaction. And then we want to return that total yearly cost. If we run that guy, actually, let's go look at the print cost method because that's where this example will be checked out. If we go into it, we will see that if we go look at this employee is Fred, his yearly cost is way too high because we messed something up massively, probably still that dividing by 2000 error. I messed up. In the employee, we don't want to multiply his performance by 100 divided by 10, right? That would multiply his salary by 10. We want to add his performance divided by 10, right? So if his performance was 100% satisfaction, this would give us 10, right? So it would add 10. We want to get a percentage. So we will get float performance bonus, which would be, we'd take his total yearly cost and we'd multiply that by 10% or whatever. So if this is between 0 and 100, we would say float, we'd give it a scale, right? So then we'd say his performance divided by 100, and we'd make that a float. So this is going to give us a percentage, right? we'll take his total yearly cost by that percentage. And actually, I should have named this percentage. And we'll add his bonus to that, to his total yearly cost. And then we have to round down because it's an integer. Okay. So now, if we go look at one of the employees, his performance is 66, and his yearly cost is 136K. We should probably break out their yearly cost and salary separately, right? So that way we can actually examine the variables. So let's do this. Let's say public, and let's return, let's call it get yearly cost, and it will return this guy. And then let's leave this as a normal get set and rename it to salary. Because you can have an hourly or a yearly salary. And then the yearly cost is based off of the salary, right? Can I put a function inside of this? Oh, I can. That's so cool. I've never done that before. Okay, I think that's a little bit cleaner, having it called getting the yearly cost based off of his salary. You don't have yearly cost anymore, you have salary. And you're no longer called random yearly cost, you're called random salary. And instead of getting a salary, we're going to get his total yearly cost. And I don't think this is going to be an issue anymore, because we're breaking out that functionality. If we go into this function. Okay, so we have Fred, whose salary is 0. Oh, we never set his underscore salary. We don't care about that. We can get rid of that now. And I should have just put the breakpoint on this line. Okay. So we have Bob, whose salary is 52K and has a performance of 2, right? So if we open up our calculator just to make sure this is correct, if his salary is 52,060, 52,060, and we want to give him a 2% bonus, so we'd multiply it by 1.02. And that would give us 53,101, and his yearly cost would be 53,101. Okay, so now we know it's calculated correctly, right? So we finish printing it all out, and we go look at our log. We can see we still spent under our million, which is our max, so none of them are incorrectly calculated, right? Okay, everything's working. We went through a lot today. I know this video is kind of dragged on for quite a while. So unless anybody has any further questions, I think I may stop it here. I will wait, 10-15 seconds for the stream to catch up, because I know it may be behind a little bit. Awesome. Yeah, I was kind of hoping I was going to teach you guys a lot about the debugger today, because it is one of the most important tools to be able to use to make your programs work. Because without it, you're kind of taking a shot in the dark as to how these things work. But yeah, thanks everybody for coming. Thanks for the ideas to keep building off of, Max. I appreciate it. Well, have a good night, everybody. Thanks for coming.